He once spent an entire year building a canoe by hand, alone, in near total silence, inside a government office he claimed to despise. Not because he needed a boat, because building something with his own two hands, in complete silence, was the only kind of control Ron Swanson had ever learned to fully trust. Ron Swanson never needed people to leave him alone. He needed a reason not to need them at all. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to know exactly which episode that Canoe first shows up in, and for years I laughed at Ron the same way everyone does, the gruff libertarian who hates his own job. But you don't just see a stoic man who'd rather build furniture than talk about his feelings. You see someone who learned, the hard way, twice, that opening up to people usually ends in losing something. By the end of this video, every silence Ron Swanson has ever sat in is going to sound a lot louder than it did before. There's a term for what Ron does. Psychologists call it repressive coping, a style where a person manages painful emotions not by processing them, but by systematically avoiding them altogether, staying so busy, so controlled, so silent, that the feeling never gets the chance to surface. It isn't the same as being calm. It's a full-time occupation disguised as calm. Ron doesn't grieve out loud. He builds a canoe. He doesn't discuss heartbreak. He goes fishing, alone, until the urge to talk about it passes. Ron rarely discusses his first marriage, and when the subject comes up, his usual stoicism curdles into something closer to genuine dread. Tammy 1 is depicted as coldly controlling, capable of dismantling Ron's composure with a single sentence, a woman who seems to know exactly which parts of him still aren't fully healed. What's notable isn't just how badly that marriage went. It's how completely Ron shut the door on it afterward, refusing to discuss details, changing the subject, treating the entire chapter of his life as a closed case file rather than an experience to make sense of. That's not emotional strength. That's a man who learned that examining the wound hurt more than simply sealing it shut. It's a pattern he'd repeat, almost identically, with the second woman who shared that same name. Ron's second marriage, to a different woman also named Tammy, follows an unnervingly similar shape. She's manipulative in a different register, seductive rather than cold, but equally skilled at pulling Ron back into a dynamic he knows, even in the moment, is bad for him. He describes losing himself around her, quite literally forgetting who he is for days at a time. The fact that Ron married two women with the same name isn't just a running joke the show plays for laughs. It suggests something more specific. A man who kept ending up in the same emotional trap, not because he couldn't see the pattern, but because recognizing it would require the kind of self-examination he'd spent his whole life avoiding. Both marriages taught him the same lesson, delivered twice, just to make sure it stuck. Opening up ends badly. Silence by comparison had never once betrayed him. Across one entire stretch of the show, Ron spends nearly a year building a canoe by hand, working quietly through his lunch breaks, saying almost nothing about it to anyone. On the surface, it reads as a simple hobby. Underneath, it's a portrait of exactly how Ron processes everything he doesn't want to feel. Woodworking gives Ron something his relationships never reliably could, a problem with a knowable outcome. Wood doesn't lie to him, it doesn't manipulate him. It responds, predictably, to skill and patience, two things Ron has in abundance and trusts completely. Every plank he sands is, in its own way, an emotion he's declined to sit with instead. That canoe isn't just a project. It's the physical shape of everything Ron has never said out loud, and it's about to sit in stark contrast with the one government job he claims to despise. Ron is a committed libertarian who believes government should do as little as possible, and yet he has spent his entire career as a government employee, eventually running the very department he philosophically opposes. Played as comedy, it's an easy contradiction to laugh at. Examined closely, it reveals something quieter about how Ron manages control. By running the Parks Department with deliberate inefficiency, minimal spending, and maximum personal authority, Ron isn't abandoning his principles. He's finding the one place where his distrust of institutions and his need for total control can coexist without conflict. He doesn't have to trust the system. He just has to be the one operating the levers inside it. It's a workaround, not a contradiction, and it mirrors almost exactly how he handles every relationship in his life. Stay close enough to maintain control, never close enough to be surprised. Leslie represents almost everything Ron claims to find exhausting: relentless optimism, deep faith in government, an emotional openness that borders on radical. And yet their friendship becomes one of the most genuinely stable relationships either character has in the entire series. What makes it work isn't compromise. It's that Leslie never once asks Ron to perform warmth he doesn't feel, and Ron never once asks Leslie to stop being exactly who she is. She earns his trust the slow way, through years of consistency rather than a single dramatic gesture, and consistency happens to be the one currency Ron has always actually valued over declarations of feeling. It's the first adult relationship in the show where Ron doesn't need a canoe or a fishing trip or complete silence to feel safe. He just needs Leslie to keep showing up exactly the way she always has. When April Ludgate joins the department as a famously apathetic intern, most of the office writes her off. Ron doesn't. He recognizes something in her detachment that he understands intimately. A person using indifference as armor, the same way he uses silence. Rather than trying to make April more enthusiastic, Ron simply gives her real responsibility and real trust without demanding she perform interests she doesn't feel. It's a strikingly gentle form of mentorship for a man who rarely shows gentleness openly, and it works precisely because Ron isn't asking her to change. He's just refusing to give up on the parts of her that everyone else finds difficult to reach. That quiet investment reveals a side of Ron that his stoicism usually keeps hidden, a genuine capacity for care, expressed through action instead of words. Because words were never a currency he learned to trust. Years after 2 failed marriages, Ron eventually meets Diane, a school administrator who notably doesn't try to soften him or fix him. She meets him with the same directness he brings to everything else, and their relationship develops with a kind of unglamorous steadiness neither of his previous marriages ever had. What's different this time isn't Ron performing less stoicism. It's Diane requiring less performance from him in the first place. She doesn't need grand declarations. She needs reliability, and reliability happens to be the one emotional skill Ron actually mastered years ago, even if he never recognized it as an emotional skill at all. By the time he starts a family with Diane, Ron isn't a changed man exactly. He's simply found for the first time a relationship built entirely out of the one currency he already knew how to offer. To understand Ron fully, it helps to understand the specific ideological tradition he's drawn from. American libertarian and self-reliance culture, especially in its Midwestern small-town form, has long celebrated a very particular kind of man: independent, distrustful of institutions, uncomfortable relying on anyone else for anything. Ron isn't just personally averse to needing people. He's the product of a cultural tradition that treats self-sufficiency as a moral virtue in its own right, one that quietly discourages the kind of emotional dependence that healthy relationships actually require. In that framework, needing help isn't just inconvenient, it's a small failure of character. That ideology gave Ron a philosophy that matched, almost too conveniently, the emotional habits his marriages had already taught him. It didn't create his defenses. It gave them a respectable name. There's a second layer of context worth examining alongside the first. Ron's specific brand of masculinity, minimal words, maximum competence, deep discomfort with visible emotion, reflects a broader Midwestern ideal that has long equated manhood with silence and self-sufficiency. In that cultural framework, a man doesn't discuss his divorce. He builds furniture. He doesn't process grief out loud. He goes hunting or fishing until the feeling passes on its own. Ron didn't invent this template. He inherited it. The same way he inherited his taste in bacon and government skepticism from an entire regional culture that had already decided, long before Ron was an adult, what emotional expression was and wasn't acceptable for a man to show. That inheritance explains why Ron's stoicism never reads, even to Ron himself, as a defense mechanism. It reads as identity, because his entire culture spent decades quietly agreeing it should. Few people at the Parks Department know that Ron has a secret double life as Duke Silver, a smooth jazz saxophonist who performs anonymously at a local lounge. Played mostly for comedic surprise, the alter ego actually reveals something quietly significant, a channel where Ron allows himself real emotional expression, just never under his own name. Jazz, unlike conversation, lets Ron communicate feeling without having to explain it, defend it, or risk it being used against him later. Duke Silver gets to be vulnerable in a way Ron Swanson never fully allows himself to be, because the persona creates enough distance to make the vulnerability feel safe. It's the clearest evidence in the entire show that Ron's stoicism isn't an absence of feeling. It's a very specific, very controlled system for making sure feeling only comes out under conditions he's fully engineered himself. Tom Haverford is, in almost every observable way, Ron's opposite. Flashy, materialistic, constantly chasing validation through image rather than substance. Ron finds him baffling for most of the series and says so often. And yet over time, Ron becomes one of the few people who quietly, consistently supports Tom's entrepreneurial ambitions, even funding one of his ventures directly. That support isn't really about believing in Tom's business plan. It's Ron recognizing, underneath all the noise, a young man building his self-worth out of external validation, the same way Ron once built his out of total self-sufficiency, just aimed in the opposite direction. Ron doesn't lecture Tom about it. He simply backs him, the same undemonstrative way he backs everyone he's decided is worth the risk. It's a small, easily overlooked relationship, but it shows Ron's care operating exactly the way it always does. Through action, through money, through showing up, never through the words he still doesn't fully trust himself to say. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Leslie Knope, the one everyone frames as Ron's total opposite, the government-loving optimist he supposedly tolerates out of workplace obligation, she's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, the only person who ever managed to get Ron to actually change his behavior, not by pushing him to open up, but by simply refusing to give up on him the way both Tammys eventually did. Think about it. Every relationship this video has covered involves Ron either avoiding vulnerability entirely or having that vulnerability weaponized against him. Leslie is the first person who has access to real information about Ron's inner life and simply never uses it as leverage. She remembers his birthday even though he claims to hate celebrating it. She protects his privacy fiercely, even from other people who want to understand him. So the woman Ron spends years describing as exhausting turns out to be the one relationship that proved his old lesson wrong, that letting someone see you doesn't automatically mean losing something. He just never had a name for what that safety actually was, because nothing in his marriages or his upbringing had ever taught him to expect it. What Ron deserved, long before the failed marriages and the government job he pretends to resent, was proof that being fully known by someone didn't have to end in loss, not silence as a substitute for trust, not a Canoe standing in for a conversation he never learned how to have. What he actually received, twice, was confirmation of his oldest fear, that opening up gets used against you, eventually, by someone who claims to love you. He built an entire identity so airtight that almost nothing could get close enough to hurt him again. He built it so well, he nearly missed the one person who never once tried to. And in the quiet, unglamorous steadiness of his life with Diane, in a friendship with Leslie that never once required him to perform anything, that was the boy from a self-reliant, silent culture finally, quietly, allowing himself to be found. The Canoe was never about the Canoe. It never was. So was Ron Swanson a stoic man, or a broken one hiding behind stoicism? Neither, honestly. Ron wasn't a naturally silent man who happened to get hurt along the way, and he wasn't a wounded man merely performing silence for effect. He was someone who turned two genuine betrayals into an entire philosophy of self-sufficiency, because it was the only shelter his marriages, and his culture, ever taught him he was allowed to build. Maybe that's truer of more quiet people than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person who says the least isn't the one with nothing to say. He's the one who learned, the hard way, exactly what saying it can cost. So here's what I want to know. If Ron had never met either Tammy, do you think he still becomes a man of so few words? Or was that armor always coming for him, one way or another, given the culture that raised him? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.